Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Greg Bry. I'm with Solar Power Events. This is part of our Think, Engage, Connect series. This is our microgrid webinar with Ryan Patterson of Emerge Alliance. You can visit all of our upcoming webinars by heading to events.solar. I'll paste the link in the chat stream here shortly. As far as this webinar goes, we're going to go through the presentation. We have two great speakers along with Brian Patterson, our host, and towards the end, we'll get to as many questions as we possibly can. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A panel and also a chat. Feel free to ask your questions throughout the presentation. We'll do our best, like I said, at the end to get to that. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Brian Patterson. And thank you again to our sponsors, Emeritus Technology, BlockEnergy, Femur, NorCal Controls, and Power Engineers. Without them, it wouldn't be possible to have this webinar today. Brian?
Yes, we definitely want to thank our sponsors because this series has been a great success so far. So we want to encourage people to take advantage of the resources that these sponsors provide. But I'll jump right into today's subject, which is energy surety and resiliency, and in particular in the context of some of our national organizations, Homeland Security, National Guard, and particularly the domestic military bases. And one of the reasons for that kind of focus, if you will, is because our experience over the last couple of months now with the pandemic has been that these organizations have become a vital part of the response and sense of I guess you'd call it security during this crisis. So all three of these organizations and the many kind of tentacles that they have out into society in a lot of different ways have been critically important. So we want to focus on what they're looking at relative to energy surety. I'm going to skip over. We'd love you to stop by the Emerge Alliance website and find out what we're doing. We're a nonprofit that's working on standards and market awareness of all these energy related things, particularly in distributed energies, DERs, and microgrids. So please stop by. But the pandemic really has hit a chord with many of us because it's kind of, again, like the canary in the coal mine. And if you're not familiar with that metaphor, it's, you know, coal miners used to carry canaries into the coal mine so that when noxious gases and poisonous gases actually would be present even at low levels, the canaries, of course, would be affected. I won't go into the gory details here, but the miners, if they saw the canary in trouble, and they would leave the mine, of course. So the question with regard to electric power and our dependence on it, our ever increasing dependence on electricity, is you know, how many lives does our power grid canary have? Because we've certainly been warned a lot of times. It's been, as some of the military folks would say, there's a lot of shots over the bow that have brought our attention to the vulnerability of our power grid. But can you imagine what would happen if we actually had a national power grid failure right in the middle of the pandemic? You know, many of us would be sitting in the dark, potentially without communications after a time. So what we've done today is we brought some really great experts in the area of resiliency and people who are particularly dealing with some of these organizations at the federal level. And they're going to talk a little bit about what their experience is and what their perspective is on the whole issue of resiliency and national emergencies and so on. Chuck Manto, some of you may have listened to him in one of our earlier webinars. He runs a company called Instant Access Networks, and he's been involved in this area for a long time. He's written several books about power infrastructure and resiliency. And I look at him as a national resiliency advocate extraordinaire. And that's why Chuck is always invited to join us when we talk about things like this. And Gary Oppedahl, another outstanding person. I like to think of Gary as a serial entrepreneur because he's been involved in so many different things, but they all have kind of a common thread in terms of the intersections between energy and communications and health and so on and so forth. And he's had a lot of commercial experience because he was a former economic development director in the city of Albuquerque, New Mexico. Both these gentlemen are also directly involved with eMERGE to give complete transparency here. And that's why we know them so well and know a lot of their background. And thanks, guys, for joining us and being able to sort of express some of our thoughts on energy and surety with regard to these organizations. So I'm going to ask Chuck, because he's dealt with this subject for quite a time. What is the Department of Homeland Security view of resilience, and how does that play out in their turf, if you will?
Well, as you know, or many know, the Department of Homeland Security has a broad scope of responsibility for all the different infrastructures. And amongst the many people who focus on this, there's been a corps of people who've looked at some of the worst case scenarios that we all need to be looking at more seriously. And the reason that's interesting and important is that you will trace or watch Homeland Security shift a little bit from only or primarily looking at the typical or the most likely scenarios that we need to be concerned about, whether it's a hurricane event or something like that, to some of the worst case scenarios. And that's a slightly different orientation. And the value of that is if we can look at the worst case scenarios, then we'll be prepared for any. But if we only look at the likely ones, we'll miss a whole lot of others.
So do they have, do they have plans for how to, react in particularly in the case of energy, and I will even narrow that further to say electricity. What are the plans include consideration of?
Well, there's a number of plans that they work with their various sectors, which are represented usually by a broad array of stakeholders. But what's really interesting is some of the work that they've been doing is focused on some of these worst case issues where they're looking at grid outage scenarios that are pretty significant for a variety of different reasons. And as you recall from our prior discussions, we're likely to get into it today, a lot of these have impacts on each other because many of our infrastructures and our critical infrastructures are mutually dependent on each other. And so when one of these are impacted, very often has negative impacts on other infrastructures, resources, and people groups.
Yeah. So Homeland Security, as you said, is very broad. And there's a lot that goes on with sort of electricity as its foundation. So do they try to look at that fabric, that weave of all the interdependencies that exist between government, the private sector, between information technology and health and communications and just running factories and stores and so on and so forth? Or how do they view that? So there's a pretty complex matrix.
Well, as many know, is not only is Homeland Security doing this sort of thing, but folks at the county level doing emergency management services and hospitals and so on, they all try to do this. And what you'll notice when you sit through many of these, what we used to be called war games, now we call them tabletop exercises, is that you work through a variety of these scenarios. But more and more people are realizing that some of their assumptions about what they would do to respond assumes that there's other resources readily available. Like in an emergency, you could just call somebody and ask for help. But what happens if communications are down and so on? So as we peel back the onion and go from the likely ones that we have more experience dealing with to the ones such as the pandemic we're experiencing now, which many of us have talked about for years, but people have basically ignored because it just seemed larger than the most likely ones. So why bother, especially if we haven't prepared for the likely ones? So now I think there's an opportunity to look at these worst case scenarios to not only prepare for the likely ones better, but to start now to improve our infrastructure to be more resilient in the long haul, and possibly make and save money in the short term to self-fund the very mitigation measures that we're learning we need to take.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people kind of aware that when something hits locally, you can always, get online or call somebody and get help. But what happens if the whole of the country is involved? And for example, that your air transportation is shut down, and so there's no FedEx and there's no UPS and no, Amazon Prime and so on and so forth. It can be a considerable dilemma when you have to be totally self-reliant for some period of time.
And the
And I guess,
military has been most understanding of that problem, and that's why the InfoGuard group, the National Disaster Resilience Council, was formed. People who do planning of this nature realize that we cross some line. Once you have a nationwide problem for more than 3 to 4 weeks, bad things happen that we're not ready to confront. And there's sort of a line in that sand. If you're looking at any kind of disaster that hits the bulk of the country for more than a month, the other people you're counting on to rescue you or help you from your mutual aid agreements or whatever are just not going to be able to do it because they have problems of their own.
yeah. And now this brings us to the point of when you look around locally, who can help you. There is an organization, I guess, generally at the state, considered at the state level mostly. It's a National Guard. And so how does a National Guard play into this fabric of energy and energy surety and resilience?
Well, the interesting thing about the National Guard, as many know, but may not, all may not know, is that there's both a federal and a state responsibility housed within the National Guard. And our Constitution, in fact, expects that we have a National Guard at every state. And that's a great place to focus because they pivot between federal and nationwide issues and state and local issues. And so when you have a major disaster, we always think of what do? You call out the Guard, right? And so the National Guard, and in similar ways, somewhat the Coast Guard, but the National Guard is particularly important to think about, has a very significant role in all of this. And we need to look and learn from them on one hand, but do a far better job of supporting them and giving them the resources they need to be able to do the job we need them to do when these really large events happen.
They are kind of the backup of the local terrain, so to speak. So in doing that, they are a part of the military, or at least they go mostly by military mission authorities and so on. So I guess that they pretty much follow the DoD and what it views as a resilience mission, right?
Yes, and so, since they have such a broad set of responsibilities that if you really think about it, it almost becomes unimaginable. The really large ones that the military focus on are the ones that they inherit. That's why the Defense Threat Reduction Agency is the part of the military where all the super geeks of weapons of mass destruction, reside, as an example. And they routinely look at these large impact events where the bulk of the country is impacted and all these infrastructures are interdependent. And that's why they have been at the Defense Threat Reduction Agency asking the military and their civilian counterparts, which includes everybody listening to this today, to become more resilient in light of these threats.
And so the Guard being the local kind of military presence, we would expect that they have sort of this self capability, built-in capability. So, and that may not be the case yet, but certainly they're moving down that path. But then you have the military itself, and you wouldn't have thought that the military per se would have a domestic role. But we have experienced in this pandemic that they actually have taken up several different roles with the Army Corps and the ships that had to port themselves on the East and West Coast for healthcare support and things like that. So the military is an important piece of the fabric here, is it not? And I'm going to turn now to Gary and talk, because I know, Gary, you've been working with the military quite closely more recently.
Yeah, and hey, by the way, good to be with you, Brian, Chuck, Greg, and welcome to all the attendees. I hope we can bring some value to you today specifically. But yeah, military is part of our fabric, part of our resources that we call up in times of emergency such as this. But they also represent a kind of a mini grid of cities across the country. If you think about it, every single military base is its own little city behind the fence. And they have the same issues with energy that we do, except they see energy as important, whereas we find it to be kind of urgent. We only notice when things go out, or if there's a hurricane, and I live in Florida, or a public safety power shutoff in Northern California. Whereas they see it as important to their mission every single day, and they think about it all the time. And so if you think about the power outages that affect military bases, and some of the military bases, such as the Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, house DOE national labs like Sandia National Lab, the Air Force Research Lab, et cetera. And so they're very, very important to us. And they have a problem in that they are currently more dependent on outside energy sources than they'd like. There was a time in the last part of the last century where they let some of their own generation go cold, so to speak, and started depending on the outside generation, for cost and other reasons. Well, now in these day and ages, you can imagine that they want to pull that back in and try to get their own capabilities and make sure that resiliency is a key.
I have noticed that the military has been very responsible in retiring some of the assets that were less desirable in terms of the environment. So, in a sense, they've sacrificed some of that capability for the right reasons, and now maybe need to start moving in the direction of replacing it as opposed to contracting it out, so to speak, or some combination at least of the above. I've heard you talk, Gary, about the 5 Rs of resiliency, and I believe that it's always been in the context of the military kind of mantra, so to speak, of how to deal with resiliency. You want to walk us through this? Because I took this directly from some of the work that you've done.
Yeah, I learned this from our customer, the Office of Energy Assurance at the Air Force. They use these 5 Rs all the time. And what I like about it is oftentimes people use resiliency and reliability interchangeably, and they're two very different things. Reliability is just what percentage of time is your electricity on a month or a year. Resiliency has to do with an event. And as Chuck was talking about just a minute ago, with tabletop exercises, you try to prepare for events as much as you can. So you build in robustness and redundancy, and you use your different resources, and resourcefulness is a key to that. But then the event occurs, and then it goes to response and recovery. And if you look at that graphic down below, what you have is normal, whatever that is, and then you have a disruption or an event, and then some of your systems go down. And then how long that area under the curve of recovery is becomes critically important to mission in military, to flights in an airport, and to some of the things that we often take for granted. What you'd like to do in an ideal situation is the event occurs and your line just keeps on going. But that is not always the case. And but the significance here is that event, right? The two R's after the event, which is response and recovery. How fast can you do it? How fast can you get your systems back online? How fast can you get your ears and eyes back on to see what's really going on and evaluate?
And, we're here talking about power surety and potential lack thereof, blackouts, or what have you. But that could be in the context, if you're in the military or National Guard, it could be in the context of something else already going on, like a pandemic. So I noticed a picture here had the soldiers have masks on. Obviously, there's a fairly contemporary picture maybe of somebody that's practicing other disciplines associated with the pandemic. But it could be in the middle of a war, or it could be in the middle of a deployment, which limits the human resource. So the military certainly has to pay attention to, as my mother used to say, the P's and Q's of it, because it's a complex matrix of potential intersections of these kinds of events. So listening to you guys, there's I've picked up on the sort of a bunch of common threads, and maybe you can help me walk through those, because I kind of jotted these down earlier when we talked as that. Chuck, maybe you could start and talk a little bit about, why are we paying so much attention to electricity in the first place?
Well, electricity and power, of any kind, is one of the essential things that drive everything else. You don't do communications well without it. You don't process water and wastewater well without it, and so on. And it's one of those several key infrastructures that fundamentally impact everything else.
And then, of course, we're talking about threats, different threats, and I think we'll get into a couple examples in a second here. But do you feel that most of these organizations at the federal level have recognized these threats and are starting to do something about them?
Yes, but certainly the institutions have. Sometimes it takes a while for a group to fully understand what subject matter experts among them understand. So this is a sort of a work in progress for everyone, but there's a strong recognition and a clear recognition that there's some impacts or threats that could impact our infrastructure that are very severe. And they're beginning to take note. It's evidenced in things like the National Defense Authorization Act and even the recent executive orders on electromagnetic pulse and some related issues to the grid.
Now, I also noticed in the discussion that there's a lot more use of the word collaboration and partnerships and public-private partnerships and so on and so forth. Is that trend likely to continue? Because typically in the big bureaucracies, it's a little tough. It gets to be siloed, and it's hard to get people across lines and work together. And in this case, it's even more difficult because you're not only talking about, cross the board at the federal level, but also coordinating with state and municipal governments all the way down to private organizations that have their own effect and use of the grid and so on and so forth. Is that being recognized?
Yes, I mean, people understand the problems with stovepiping, but the fact is everybody's really busy. And in some cases, it's not even encouraged to have cross stovepipe conversations. Sometimes in government because of separation of powers, sometimes because there's a little bit of competition between pots of money and access to people who have the ability to make something happen. But the big part of this interdependency problem is that we have these really large centralized systems like power grids, like communications networks that are dependent on each other. And the only way to solve that interdependency vulnerability is not only to strengthen these centralized systems, but to break them down into smaller components that are decentralized, so that when the large centralized infrastructures inevitably fail, that these smaller distributed infrastructures can keep on running and make it possible for the group to reconstitute themselves in an adaptable way. But just trying to do everything in one large monolithic approach is seen as something unwieldy, and it's almost a losing battle before you start if that's all you're doing. You have to really change the nature of the game, change the rules, and shift to a coordinated approach where you have centralized systems working with the decentralized systems so that the decentralized ones can operate on their own in what they call island mode or autonomy.
Yeah. So Gary, how's that playing out in the work that you're doing? There's this notion of distributed action and to a certain degree self-reliance.
I think the military certainly gets that right away and always has. But really, the only path forward inevitably is going to be for a distributed system where stuff at the edge, such as microgrids, can survive if the central goes down. We've seen this in other areas like information and computing, and we've seen the benefits of that. So I think there's a sense of urgency to get there with the energy system also. And again, when you talk about the distributed system, you can look at alternative fuels and generation for a couple of different reasons. One is sustainability. The other is supply chain. And if your supply chains are cut off, sometimes generators, for instance, aren't going to be able to run if they don't have a fuel supply. And so I think, look, it's just a nice combination, a convergence, if you will, of the trying to get to be distributed, looking at a meshed network of microgrids to work at grid edge from the central grid, and looking at alternative fuels and generation. Just we have a nice convergence going here. Moving forward. And I think the military recognizes that, and that's why they're starting to look at microgrids such as ours at Kirtland Air Force Base.
One of the things that I notice in the documentation, I've read some of the plans now on resiliency of the federal organizations, and the term microgrid appears more frequently than ever. Despite the fact that I think the Navy probably had microgrids from the get-go, because every ship in itself has to be a self-sufficient, generate its own power and so on. Maybe there's some differences.
Every submarine and the International Space Station, for that matter.
There you go. And the other places that we're probably used to and been around for 20 years or more is things like missile silos and nuclear plants and things like that. But we're not talking about that kind of self-reliance or distributed reliance. We're talking about across the board, right? Of all the functionality, both in the military and federal apparatus and infrastructure, as well as the civilian part. Isn't that true? No? Okay.
I wasn't sure if you're talking to Gary or Chuck, but I think
either one.
I think we both agree that if you start with military bases, for example, they need their civilian counterparts down the street, whether it's the water utility, the hospital, the local fire engine to help put out a fire. Sometimes they require that kind of support as well. And every citizen, everybody who works on that base has to live somewhere, and the people who support them live somewhere. So really, you have to bring this down to the individual piece of property or the building or the citizen for this to make sense. And so resilience really is a community thing that relates to both the infrastructure and the people in their relationships.
I noticed in looking at a number of these organizations that they've always had some sort of plan, contingency plans or emergency plans, but the focus on true resiliency across the board, integrated in this both public and private fabric, is probably a newer dimension to all this. And you had a comment, Gary?
Oh, I was just going to say, as commercial and housing developments, small towns and cities, as Chuck was mentioning, can learn from the effort and brainpower that the military has put into this to date. There's no reason not to leverage that. We shouldn't reinvent the wheel. Take what they've done by effort and concentration and focus, and utilize it within the civilian or commercial world.
Yeah, because these threats to power surety are universal. They're not necessarily targeted at any sector of the society. And obviously there's been a focus on the cyber and physical kind of impacts on grid and power systems in general. And then there's this distinction between, probably for a long time, we looked at weather events and things like that, natural causes, as being predominant. But more and more, we're becoming aware that there are potentially man-caused, and man-caused can be just accidental, or they can be purposeful. But definitely there's the impact there. And then I think with the pandemic, as it has lasted as long as it has, that we recognize that there's a sort of an immediate impact, you know, that, and then there's this longer term impact where you start running out of things, whether it's in the case of this pandemic, I don't know, for some reason, you know, paper goods and meat supply and food supply for some people, you know, got to be difficult and so on and so forth. So those are all the indirect impacts that probably go across the board. I want to pick your brain, Chuck, because again, you've become somewhat of the national expert on EMP and what it's all about. But most people don't really understand EMP, or if they do, they're not really sure of how it would have a similar impact or as widespread an impact as a pandemic. Could you talk us through that a little bit?
Well, there's electromagnetic threats are sort of broad in scope, and they can be caused by small man-made devices, something like an enlarged microwave, for example, driving or being driven in the back of a panel van, and you aim it at the right spot, you know, a few hundred yards away, and you could disrupt or damage electronics. During the Cold War, we recognized that when we detonate a nuclear weapon about 12 to 300 miles up, you have something called the Compton effect, where things that are coming out of the broken atom, like gamma rays, will impact or will hit, say, molecules in the thin atmosphere and knock electrons off, which will come streaming down to Earth. And you have basically an electromagnetic field impacting everything below. And there's I guess in the slide here, you talked a little bit or showed that.
Yeah, so basically these electromagnetic pulses, right? They radiate from whatever that source is, right? Whether it's natural or man-made. And how do they, people say they damage the electrical power infrastructure, the communications infrastructure. How does it do that?
Well, first of all,
because they're basically invisible, right? These are invisible kind of things.
Right. So first of all, there's a reasonable similarity but difference between a man-made electromagnetic event caused by an upper atmosphere nuclear weapon, for example, and the picture on the slide in the upper right shows these concentric circles. It looks like a bullseye, and a solar storm, which impacts us differently or has a different effect. In the case of the bullseye, what you'll see is if you have a nuclear weapon, if you are 30 miles high, you have a 480-mile radius. If you're 120 miles high, you have a 1,000-mile radius. And if you're 300 miles high, you have a 1,470-mile radius. So when one of those events happen, you have a near simultaneous effect across the entire continent. And what's interesting about how this works in EMP, it doesn't always work like the inverse square of the distance in other physics because of the nature of where these molecules are being knocked off. You might have a pretty large impact in the center, wherever the center is, and still at the coast still have a very large effect. So this is something that's very serious, and it can cause disruption and damage to all kinds of electronics, whether it's something that's inside your computer and SCADA devices, or on something as large as a transformer.
So people have explained to me that it can actually electromagnetically, just like a transformer does itself, it can couple that electromagnetic pulse or that energy onto the wires, and then almost like a surge of power can go along and start to knock out transformers or other things, in addition to the interruption in the communications, which is even more fragile.
Yeah, so what happens in one of these events, you have a radiated pulse that goes through the air and it just continues. And if you have a rack of computer equipment, that radiated pulse will go through the walls and just glom onto anything that's a conductor. But as you said, that same electromagnetic energy will glom onto conductors like wires. So your power line and your communications line, if it has anything metal or conductive in it, will be another source. So you get zapped two ways. You get zapped through the air and you get zapped through your conductors. And the things you have to do to protect yourself have to protect from both of those avenues of attack.
Now, one of the things that I remember, and we talked a little bit about the other night in our after hours webinar, was the fact that just a single tree falling on a power line does have the possibility of this cascading linear dynamic effect in the grid, because of the way the grid is organized, and the fact that the grid in many cases still relies on human intervention or some kind of electromechanical switching to prevent these kind of moving, cascading interruptions from happening. And so I guess the point here is that just a single pulse could actually cascade or be like a set of domino effect and affect a much wider area than where the pulse itself first starts. And it's sort of like the virus, right? The virus came in maybe to 1 or 2 ports of the United States, but pretty quickly spread to the almost the entire continent.
That's true. And I sponsored some years back an economic impact assessment of even a regional EMP event. And what you do is you look at the various kinds of large and small systems, and you look at what's called mean time to repair or mean time to replace or average time to replace. And what you'll notice is that there's some things that you might be able to replace rather quickly, but other things have a long lead time, maybe as much as a year or 2. And that's what cripples us and cause us to fail to provide the resources we need for the bulk of the country to thrive.
Now, I do hear that some people who are aware of EMP a little bit more still are kind of doubting Thomases and say, well, that, it's by theory that can happen, but it'll never really happen, right? Could you dissuade us? Are there examples of near misses that you can refer to here?
Well, and certainly, and it's useful to remember on the human side, you don't need a nuclear event to do this, and you don't need nation states going to war to do this. And that was part of the findings of the EMP Commission report. But they also focused on this natural phenomenon of extreme space weather, one version of which is a coronal mass ejection. And we had a big one, for example, in 1859, observed by an amateur astronomer named Carrington, so it's been named the Carrington effect. And telegraph equipment was damaged and so on. And they estimate that if something like that happened now, we could have a year to 18-month blackout, certainly across the Northeast and likely across the country. And something that validated that was in 2012, in July, we had one of these larger coronal mass ejections coming right at us. But fortunately, we scooted out of the way just by days, maybe about a week, and it hit our satellites instead, which gave our experts a chance to get a treasure trove of data showing the size and impact of something like that. And that happened in July of 2012. Estimates range that we could have had as much as a continental-wide, and it could be a global phenomenon, where you would have more than a year-long blackout. Now imagine if you just began a global or at least a continental-wide blackout starting in July of 2012, and in the end of September, October, Hurricane Sandy hits. Well, most likely those people would have been blindsided. No one would have been able to escape by having early warning. And then when they would have been hit, there'd be no one available for the most part to help them, because they'd all be, trying to get out from under their own disaster.
Right.
So this is an example of a near miss that would have been aggravated by Hurricane Sandy at the same time.
Well, I know that most of the organizations are recognizing now very fundamentally this threat and are starting to put in place plans for reacting and so on. We're going to have to jump ahead a little bit, because I want to talk about what some real things that are going on that these groups are doing to start fundamentally changing the way they operate in order to provide a better I guess you'd call it safety net of federal response by maintaining their own power systems. And in the case of the National Guard, I see them putting in pilot programs now with microgrids. But one of the challenges there is, how do they afford that? Because of the National Guard isn't as well endowed with the financial resources as, say, the straight up military or even Homeland Security in many cases.
Yes, and the good news of this problem is that by looking at this from what Gary calls a block point of view, or I call a modular point of view, and then aggregating that together so they could work with each other, very often you can save enough money when you're making your own power to reduce the cost, and at times then make more than you need and be able to sell it into the market. So by taking the money you save and the money you earn, you could fully fund your mortgage payment for your new microgrid that the private sector would be willing to fully fund up front, as long as they know you're committed and ready to make those payments from the combination of savings and earnings. And Gary's work is particularly promising in this area. We've talked to a number of National Guard units around the country about this, and they're doing different pieces of this puzzle now. More needs to be done, because when you do a microgrid, you need to make certain that the microgrid is protected from the same threats like electromagnetic threats or cyber threats as the larger grid elements need to be protected as well.
Exactly. Well, you mentioned Gary a number of times, so I'm going to let him tell us a little bit about some of the things that he's been working with the DoD in various areas. I guess specifically with the Air Force at the Air Force Base in Albuquerque. So Gary, can you tell us a little bit about what's going on there at Kirtland? If you may be on mute.
Sorry, I'll roll through this quickly so that we can get to some questions and answers. Yeah. But basically, all military bases are required to come up in the next couple of years with their resiliency plan, because Central Command has figured out that this is a big deal and there's a sense of urgency around it. So locally here, in talking with our base commander, we said, hey, we want to get moving on this thing. And we got permission to go at the beginning of last year. The ribbon cutting that you see down there in the lower right is in September. And we've commissioned a microgrid there that operates fully autonomously and would continue working indefinitely, even if the bulk power grid completely failed. So that was their intent. And we've involved Sandia National Labs because not often, but sometimes the two branches, the DOE and the DoD, work together. The DOE has been tasked by mission to protect some of the most critical infrastructure, including military bases. And so we were able to work with Sandia National Labs on what's called a collaborative research and development agreement, so that we could have the triad of DOE, DoD, and commercial entity working together to come up with a solution, and that's what we did there. If you want,
that's what I found very unique. And Sandia Labs at that location are really doing a lot of the solar work and other renewable energy work. So it's kind of a natural nexus for the military. It'd be one of the larger, more strategic Air Force bases in the country, one of the largest labs working in renewable energy, and of course the private enterprise like yours. And for those who don't know, Emeritus Technologies is actually a non-regulated subsidiary, I guess, or of Emera, who's an operating utility, has territories up and down the East Coast, and I think down in the Caribbean, right, Gary?
This whole thing was born of resiliency because we were looking to put in a distribution system that wouldn't get blown down every time there was a hurricane or a bomb cyclone. And that's when we started looking at DC, low voltage DC, as a path toward that in a hybrid system of DC and AC, totally interoperable with the utility grid. Because our whole strategy is to look at how can we make a holonic, a situation where if you're grid tied and you're tied to the utility grid can get support from the microgrid and vice versa. But if you lose the utility grid, you've got all of the microgrid resources available and shared among its constituents. And then even if you lose the microgrid, each individual building has its own energy source. Now, this is much better in a tabletop exercise. As we were talking about earlier, you don't have to think about which building gets the diesel gen set. All the buildings have this capability. And then when they're all meshed together, then they're even more powerful. And they're even more powerful when they're connected to the grid. If you think about an individual PC, a local area network, and the cloud, we're just recreating that. And if you can make that holonic, in other words, if a piece is broken off, it becomes its own whole, then that just works better for everyone.
So this is a great diagram, but you guys are doing some real stuff. So how does that play out?
Well, you can flip forward to a couple of these slides, and we can just flip through this. This is our actual microgrid. It involves everything from a laundromat for some fun, little C&I, to cooperating with the Photovoltaic Systems Evaluation Lab at Sandia National Labs across the street, and a grid tie into the base grid where we're constantly exporting energy because we're over-solared. And then we have N1 through N6 in this picture is base housing. And so we've got residential loads, and N7 is our demonstration building, which you'll see in a second. We actually have also high-speed EV chargers, 50 kilowatt EV chargers that run right off the DC, so you don't lose the efficiencies of going from DC from your solar to AC and then back to DC into the electric vehicle. And then N9 there off to the left,
sorry.
that's okay, is our distributed energy technology lab. That's where they design the DC microgrids. They've got hardware in the loop microgrids there for designing for Navy ships, nuclear submarines, and the International Space Station. So if you go to the next slide, you can see that's my car actually being charged by a high-speed charger there, fast charger. That's the demonstration building that we built in the middle of this, and I highly recommend anybody, once we can start flying again, to come down and see this project and sit in the middle of it. But the great thing about it is it has been running autonomously because we've got controls and all of those little block boxes that sit outside of every building that all practice game theory and machine learning around each other. And so it all works autonomously and has been working since we commissioned it last year flawlessly, all on its own, eyes on, hands off. That's the central box. We've got some extra central battery and our grid tie and some more generation. And then if you keep going, Brian, that's one of the base houses that we put solar on. That's now part of this microgrid. And these houses will go. There's some ground-based solar at the Photovoltaic Science Evaluation Lab, and so this system comprises of a system that here, if you push click here, these were taken yesterday. This is real time. Part of resiliency is getting your eyes and ears back. So many times, if you're running a base, if you're running an airport. Even when I used to run an Intel fab, you see the lights blink and you start making phone calls. What's up? What's down? What's up? Well, in this situation, you can see at a glance what's going on in your whole entire system. If you go to the next one, that's our engineering view. Our user interface for the operator is the next slide. And if you want to hit click on that, again, this was from yesterday, then you can actually see the yellow is the solar coming from the roofs. The blue is the AC going into the homes. The green is the grid energy. And you can see that traveling between the various loads in the microgrid, and you've got complete history. So even if you have an event, as Chuck was talking about earlier, let's say you have an event and it was a month ago, you know exactly the second before and the second after, exactly what happened before and after that event. And that really helps with resiliency.
So if I'm not mistaken, this shows that you're actually net exporting back out to the base grid.
You can see that we've got in that left panel is a dashboard. Is a dashboard for the whole microgrid. We've had 164% of solar in our system, more than the load, and so. And you can see the tons of CO2 we've saved up above. And anyway, you have complete vision into everything that's going in here, watt by watt, second by second. That is the resiliency play, because not only can you do you get energy to the right places at the right time in normal operation, but post-event, you know everything that's going on in your system.
So if you have storage at each of these nodes, like at each building, or how's that work?
Every building has its own storage, its own generation, its own power electronics, and its own controls. Because our theory is if you're going to distribute your generation, you better distribute your storage. Otherwise, in a power outage, as the people in Northern California just figured out, you don't have even access to your own solar panels unless you have a system like this that integrates storage. And if you're going to do that, well, then you might as well put controls out there so that everybody can play nice in the sandbox together and share that energy among the different loads when necessary.
So we probably don't have time to go into all the detail, but basically you sort of have a grid of grids here, because you have an individual little microgrid at each building, but then you have sort of a neighborhood cluster, and then you have this energy block, which is more like the community level stuff, all the way back connected to the standard grid.
And the microgrid can even provide reactive power and support to the grid. So we think everything should play together and in a modularized way, all work together as a mesh network.
So you get all the benefits of the networking effect, so to speak.
Exactly.
Now, both of you guys talk about this with slightly different language, but really essentially the same thing. It's kind of modular. It's both every part. It can be a whole if it needs to be, meaning that it can island and so on and so forth. There's different terminology, but you're seemingly on the same page in terms of the basic topology of this architecture. Let's not spend too much more time here and see if we have some questions, because I want to see if there are questions about what we've discussed all throughout here. So I'll refer to Greg. Greg, are there any questions that have come in about some of the things we've talked about and that we can address?
Quite a bit from the crowd, and feel free to add them into the Q&A and we'll do our best to get to them. For microgrids on military installations, how is the cybersecurity issues being handled?
Well, I'm glad you asked that. We are working with Sandia National Labs, who, by the way, has the best cybersecurity in the world because they guard our nation's nuclear secrets at Sandia National Labs there in collaboration with Los Alamos National Labs. And we have been chosen as a partner to commercialize some of that very cyber right into our system. So our DUNS and Weasel board and, protect the castle. And then, when you get a threat, what do you do with it? We are building that right into our system right from the start. And I know that there hasn't been a whole lot of attention paid to the distribution side of things of the grid with respect to cyber and other EMP and other effects, but we are working with Sandia National Labs on all of that right from the start.
So one of the things you can do is sort of monitor threats at every level in the system, right? And then and then you can, almost like we do with the pandemic, we can socially distance. In this case, we can technologically distance or island the nodes and the modules or whatever we want to call them from each other, so you don't pass on corrupted cyber information and or control commands.
And that's the best part of being tied into the labs there, especially Dettel, because that's exactly what they do. They put in tests and they actually throw things at us with respect to lightning, EMP, ground lift, and cyber.
More questions, Greg?
Yeah, one question that came from a couple folks out there was, is the military looking into vehicle-to-grid interconnectivity for storage? I think another follow-up to that is the military looking at mini-grid deploying systems when they're off base somewhere?
I was just with last Friday all-day seminar from the Army Futures Command talking about exactly that. They're exactly thinking of that. They're going to have mobile vehicles with onboard generators in addition to the engine for driving them around that will constantly be charging batteries and systems and be able to come up multiple vehicles at a time to a base camp and supply energy. So they're absolutely looking at V2G, vehicle to grid, sorry, and they're probably one of the first deployers. Until we have racks and racks of EVs sitting in a garage and fleet type of effects, then V2G is going to be tougher to work out. But once you have systems with onboard that are designed for that, like the military is doing, or lots of EVs in one space, then that makes a lot of sense.
So in a certain sense, vehicles can be considered portable storage, I guess, and
portable storage and generation.
and sort of a virtual storage plant in addition to the virtual generator concept. Next question, Greg.
Yeah. So when someone asked in general, I think this would be more for Chuck, has there been a EMP attack used in a military circumstance? And then in general, how is the military and bases guarding microgrids against EMP events?
So it's a good question. Since Desert Storm, for example, there are a lot of public examples of EMP at the tactical level as opposed to strategic level. So you'll have very precise use of EMP. There are things that you can look online and look at US and Russian capabilities with EMP of various kinds and incidents where they actually may have been used. In terms of protection of military assets, you know, historically, we basically protected our ability to have a nuclear response. That was our priority, getting through World War III. Only now are we beginning to look at conventional non-nuclear uses of EMP and scenarios where EMP was not prelude to global nuclear war. And so for reasons such as that, and also terrorism events or criminal activities, for example, a criminal might attack a group, especially if you're a public company and you're thinking commercially, instead of ransomware, somebody could just attack a public company, disable them because they've shorted their stock, and they'll never ask anything from you because you've already given them the gift.
Mm. Okay, on that wonderful note, take another question.
Yeah. Well, I think we'll do one more here just because we're going to wrap up.
Yeah.
Be respectful of everyone's time. I think we can throw this to both Gary and Chuck and even you, Brian. If you were heading up a military base or the DHS, what would be one thing that you're looking to do in the next year or so to make sure that you're more resilient or secure from a cyber attack of some sort?
I'll do a first one and then Gary can build on it. I would create these, I would look at command and control and what you need to survive, and basically have command and control modules, including its power. So you have the microgrid and its loads as a package, as a system, and look at it from a systems point of view, and make certain that those are resilient from all threats, including the worst case electromagnetic and cyber threats.
And I would add to that, and just from a practical standpoint, you know, anytime you're repairing a roof on a military base, you got to throw solar up there. If you're going to put solar on, you might as well put storage, and you might as well then put some intelligence there and start making your microgrids. Now, I think we need to start thinking about, and this is a very good question, we need to start thinking about incremental progress towards the inevitable instead of just waiting for a huge disaster and then we spend a bunch of money all at once to try to redo a lot of the grid edge. I think it's important that we start looking. This technology is available now. So if you're doing a new build, you ought to install it. And if you're doing a retrofit because or a repair on something, you ought to consider it, because the technology exists and we got to start incrementally making progress.
And whatever you do in the short term, you should have a mind for what your long-term plan is and what your long-term topology and structure is, so that you don't do something short-term that ends up as a stranded asset or a stranded capability. So even if you're going to, and most of the time it's necessary to sort of harden existing systems and so on, but do it in a way that makes it compatible with a forward-leaning replacement and or advancement of the type that Gary's talking about when you need to replace things. So there's a lot you can do in that regard to prepare for, you know, not having continuing to build on a legacy of potential stranded assets. I think, Greg, if I can, I'm just going to summarize a few things about. There's a lot more we could talk about, obviously, and we will be talking about. In the next few weeks, we're going to be talking about it in a number of different webinars that I'm going to show you in a second. But also all of this culminates in an event in September in Anaheim that is truly the most complete distributed energy event in the industry, because it covers such a broad array of different technologies. And obviously people like Chuck and Gary and so many other people, our sponsors, are all there to really answer the questions you have about this and to show you what their solutions are to solve this. And the registration for that event is open. It's on the web. You can make note of it here, and I'm sure if you go to the site that Greg put in the chat before, you can also couple into it there. So we look forward to that. In the coming weeks leading up to that event, we have many more webinars. The next one is going to be specifically talking about the use of direct current, more and more use of direct current, both in terms of sources of energy and loads, and the manipulation or control of energy in the context of microgrids. So we talked last week about AC and DC coupling. This time we're going to talk much more about DC and what it potentially can add to the mix in a hybrid way in these types of microgrids. But we don't stop there. We're going to be talking about EV charging and DC and AC multiplex appliances and so on. So I'd like to summarize just by saying thanks to our sponsors one more time. FEMA, who is going to be at the show in booth 2904, does a lot of work in the inverter area at all levels. Power Engineers, a consulting engineering firm that does specialize in battery storage and solar use in your, attached to the grid. So they'll be at the show also at booth 2908. NorCal Controls, again, a leader in control systems, SCADA, DAS, and so on. And they'll be there to answer all your questions about some of the different control options. And of course, our premier sponsor, Emeritus Technologies, who will be at the Smart Energy Microgrid Theater, which is one of the main destinations for a lot of the discussions that will happen at this event. So with that, I will thank everybody. I know we're a couple minutes over, and I apologize for that, but hopefully we'll see you at or hear from you at our next webinars, and possibly see you at North America Smart Energy Week in September. Thank you, everybody, and have a great day.